All right, here we are for another episode in the concussion series. And this time, what we're talking about is POTS, otherwise known as postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, which basically means that I change positions. So I go from typically it's lying to a standing position. My heart rate starts beating really, really fast. And then I get all kinds of different symptoms that we'll discuss in today's class. So my name is Dr. Matthew Shem. I am the owner of Peak Brain Performance Centers located here in Colorado Springs. And the first thing I wanted to do is talk about what is the definition of POTS so that we have a better understanding of what POTS really is. So POTS in this article is defined as whenever you go from a lying to a standing position and your heart rate increases by greater than or equal to 30 beats per minute within that initial 10 minutes upon standing. And symptoms that you can see range from a wide gamut of different things. So you could have lightheadedness, exercise intolerance, chronic fatigue, dizziness, sleep disturbance, headaches, tremors, tachycardia, anxiety, depression, gastrointestinal disturbances, syncopal episodes, which basically means you stand up and you pass out, or vision changes. And these are very, very common, especially after concussion, because if you remember when we talked about concussion before and how when your brain gets rocked inside of your skull, it causes this this torsion on the brainstem. And the example that we gave before is if I have a wet towel and I wring out that wet towel, the center part of that towel gets wrung out the most. And the same kind of thing applies to why dysautonomia, the broad umbrella term that POTS fits underneath, that makes sense as to why that's very, very common of at least the patients that I see who are post-concussion, because the areas that regulate your autonomic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system in general is more so within that center part of your brainstem. And so that leads people to have these autonomic findings or POTS-like symptoms after concussion. So what is the real cause of someone who experiencing POTS? There's a couple different ways that we can go about this. And the example that I like to give, just before we dive into the nitty gritty of it, is let's say I have a cup, right? I have this cup, and if I hold a cup underneath a faucet and have the faucet just fill up this cup, and I'm holding it under the faucet for, let's say, 10 seconds. And every 10 seconds, I flip the cup over and I dump the water out. Let's imagine that every time I flip that cup over is the same as the heart pumping. And so now what happens if instead of 10 seconds, I only let the cup sit under the faucet for 5 seconds? Obviously, it doesn't fill up as much, right? And so same thing happens with the heart. So people with POTS, what happens is I stand up, my heart gets going really, really fast, which basically is what tachycardia means. Your heart starts pumping really fast. And when your heart starts pumping really fast, it's just like that cup under the faucet. It's pumping more frequently, which basically means there's less time in between pumps that the heart has time to fill. So the heart is pumping faster, but it's not getting a whole lot of blood back up to the heart. And why does this happen? So when I stand up, what would typically happen, just because the natural way that gravity works, is the blood is going to move from my head down my body and into my torso because the way that gravity works, right? And so we have a mechanism in our carotids called a baroreceptor, and on the arch of our aorta, on the arch of our heart. And so these little baroreceptors are basically little stretch receptors. And so these receptors are kind of like a little balloon that sense stretch, okay? And as the blood is coming away from my heart, these baroreceptors should say, hey, blood is leaving my head. So now what I need to do is I need to tell the brainstem to tell the heart to pump faster so that I can get blood back up to the head and I don't get lightheaded. And so oftentimes people with concussion, they have this mechanism little skewy. And so what happens is the heart rate ends up going fast, which is what we need it to do. We need it to pump a little bit faster to get blood back up to the head, but it goes too fast. And like we said before, if it's going too fast, now the heart doesn't have enough time to actually fill enough fluid into the heart in between contractions. So for one, we can have a problem with the actual heart itself. There could be some sort of problem with the actual heart itself in regards to regulating the pressure and getting the blood back up to the head. Another thing that we see very, very common, especially after concussion, is it could be a problem with the actual inner ear. Because whenever I stand up, I should have this gravity sense that's telling my brain that says, hey, we just stood up and now we need to predict where we're going to need to send blood. So probably the head, probably the legs to be able to actually do the activity of standing. So I need to put blood in my legs. I need blood back up to the head so I don't get lightheaded. And so there can be a problem with the inner ear because our inner ear is our gravity detector. And so now if the inner ear isn't detecting gravity appropriately, maybe you have situations where if I stand up and I'm standing completely vertical and you have something wrong with your inner ear that still says that you're at 70, 80 degrees instead of the full 90, right? And so these are the kind of things that you can see that could lead to or could be indicative of something wrong with the inner ear. And then also it could be just a problem with the actual brain itself, or more specifically the brain stem, and regulating your autonomics to be able to know where to shunt blood to at the appropriate time, depending on the movement that you're trying to accomplish, right? And so just like in all the other videos, I think this kind of goes to show how important it is for you as the patient who is struggling with, let's say, POTS-like symptoms, to find a provider who is going to be able to understand the wide gamut that is dysautonomia, or if you're struggling with POTS in particular, POTS in general. So it's important to find a provider that knows that type of diagnosis, what is the mechanisms that could be leading to these different types of symptoms, so that they can find the most appropriate mechanism behind why you are experiencing POTS-like symptoms, which then leads to the most appropriate care plan for you to get better in the fastest way possible. So thank you for joining today's class. If you have any questions, like always, feel free to email me or give my office a call. And other than that, I look forward to seeing you in the next one.